Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. Now, before we get started, I've known Drew for close to 10 years. He's interviewed countless authors for us. He's put together panels for us, but somehow this is our very first in-person book launch with Drew. It's a party. It's a celebration. Please give a round of applause for Drew. Before we get started, I do have some quick housekeeping notes. One, we have recently announced the return of the 13th annual Harrisburg Book Festival. Mark your calendars for October 15th to the 19th, where we'll be hosting Nick Offerman, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Marie Lu, Justin Driver, Carissa Broadbent, and many more authors. We'll also be hosting our annual tent sale right on Quebec Street right next to the bookstore, featuring 30,000 books priced at just $1, $2, and $3. And I do have to mention that while we have many sponsors for the festival, I have to give a special shout out to Messiah University. They've been supporters of the festival from day one. Let's give them a round of applause. Lastly, some of you already have a copy of Making It Plain, but we do have copies available for purchase up at the cafe. And we'll be having a book signing with Drew immediately following the event in our rare book room, which is out those doors and to the left. As always, thank you for supporting our authors, the bookstore, and the future of this event series. At this time, I have the honor of introducing our speakers this evening. Our interviewer is Pete Enns. Peter is the Abrams S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies at Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania. He has written numerous books, including The Bible Tells Me So, The Sin of Certainty, and How the Bible Actually Works. A huge thank you to Peter for joining us this evening, and we do have signed copies available of all of Peter's books for purchase up at the cafe. Of course, our featured author this evening is Dr. Drew G.I. Hart. Drew is an associate professor of theology at Messiah University, where he has directed the Thriving Together Congregations for Racial Justice program in Central Pennsylvania since 2021. He co-hosts the Inverse podcast with Australian peace activist Jared McKenna, and is the author of Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, and Who Will Be a Witness, Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Drew regularly speaks at colleges, conferences, churches, and community groups across the country, and he is married to Renee and is the father of 3 sons. Of course, tonight we are here to launch Drew's new book, Making It Plain, Why We Need Anabaptism and the Black Church. I've got to read just one blurb. This one's from Shane Claiborne, who writes, quote, Anabaptism and the Black Church offer a much-needed cure to the malignant theology that is spreading quickly throughout the church in the United States and beyond. We need this book, now more than ever, to remember the past so that we can build a better future both for the church and the world, unquote. It's an honor to welcome Drew and Peter to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Now what do we do? Oh, we'll talk about the book a little bit?
I guess so. I guess we will.
Yeah, I should say, I read the book, obviously. Wouldn't be here if I didn't, right? So,
thanks, Pete.
The first half, anyway, I read. But in all honesty, Drew, your book helped me re-remember some things that I needed to re-remember. It just taught me things I didn't know.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for writing. It's wonderful. So, all righty. Well, what led you to believe that bringing together Anabaptist and Black church traditions wasn't just possible, but necessary?
I guess the answer to that question is just my lived experience, first and foremost. I knew that it was a meaningful thing precisely because I had been working through it for decades. I'm a child of the Black church, so my first 18 years, that's all I knew. But after that, I got exposed to this thing called Anabaptism that I had never heard of before. Slowly and surely kind of figuring out what it actually meant, beginning to see that it is expressed in different ways, in different contexts, and realizing that there's something really meaningful about that tradition that also speaks to some of the challenges that we're facing in our society. And so as I began to see the issues that we were confronting in our society, the injustices, and how Christians were responding to them in meaningful ways at times and in really troubling ways at other times, it's both of those traditions together that actually gave me the lens and the framework to actually name it very precisely, as well as offer constructive pathways forward. And so I think it was that lived experience and that journey over decades that provided a lens for me seeing this is a gift that I think everybody can kind of draw on, even if they're not a part of these two traditions.
I mean, so together they do something that's separate. They don't do well, let's say.
Right, that each of them offer distinct gifts and weaknesses that I think are really something really generative happens when you put them in conversation and they're allowed to dialogue.
Yeah.
And so you put these two traditions in conversation and you let them feel a little tension, right? And I think that something beautiful comes out on the other side.
So, I mean, could you just flesh out a little bit the strengths and weaknesses of each? How do they help each other, and maybe where might they be pulling apart a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ways that I kind of frame in the book, the gift of Anabaptism in particular, is thinking about it as, and I kind of front this, that it's an anti-Christendom tradition. And I actually challenge how white North American Anabaptists have talked about their own tradition by fronting pacifism. And I think that by doing that, they're actually losing sight of something really meaningful in terms of just how Anabaptism emerged in the midst of Christendom. And when I say Christendom, I'm talking about Christian supremacy over Western society. It's the merging of church and state, right? Empire and faith commingling together. That in the 16th century, Anabaptism emerged under that context. And broke radically from it. Broke from the church-state religion, broke from all the civic expectations of what it meant to be a Christian, and embodied and sought to live out what it meant to follow Jesus radically on the ground. And so I think there is a gift in that radical discipleship, that anti-Christendom tradition, and then out of that, this peace ethic that was birthed out of that in that context that I think is really helpful. And it does provide, I think, a lens for perceiving Christian nationalism, I think for looking at complicity of Christians with violence in our world today. On the other hand, I think that the black church, again, so if the Anabaptists are born on the underside of Christendom, you have the black church born on the underside of the legacy of the doctrine of discovery and colonial conquest and anti-blackness, right? You have centuries of slavery that is completely, and you'll see in the book, it's completely underwritten theologically and legislated by Christians, white Christians, right? And so to think about the black church born on the underside and how they encountered a liberating Jesus, a co-suffering Jesus, a friend in hard times, right? Not the Jesus that was being preached to them. They didn't just, I think Yolanda Pierce says it well, they didn't just adopt the Christianity and internalize the Christianity that was being told to them, but they adapted it and they reinterpreted it and reimagined it for themselves as they encountered and sought to follow Jesus. And so there, out of that came a liberating faith and a prophetic witness that spoke truthfully to empire and to injustice and to the things. And so when you begin to put those two into conversation together, I think Anabaptism helps. It's not that there aren't folks in the black church that haven't talked about like Christian nationalism. They certainly are. And right now, many are doing it, maybe even more upfront than some Anabaptists are. But as a tradition, they have this long history of anti-Christendom, as many call it anti-Constantinian, right? Kind of postures that I think is really helpful for our moment. And in the black church, where Anabaptists have fallen short often is they've often thought of themselves as a counter community or an alternative community and have often not done very well with how to actually engage the society in meaningful ways. So like one example I give in the book, during slavery, most Anabaptists unlike most Christian traditions, deemed slavery wrong, right? They didn't have major splits like almost every other tradition did over slavery, but they were pretty politically quietist about slavery as well. And so the Black church, I think, provides a way for them to follow Jesus in a prophetic way that actually challenges injustice in the society and actually demonstrates concretely their love for their neighbor, not just concern for their own well-being and their own communities.
Well, I mean, this may be almost too basic a question, but I'm wondering if maybe you could flesh out your understanding of what Christendom is. How would you define that in a tweet or two?
Yeah. So Christendom, again, so it's Christian, sometimes I call it Christian supremacy over society, or coercive top-down Christianity, right? It's imagining not Christianity as a voluntary grassroots movement, but it's imposing and trying to a unified single vision, often diseased vision, as Jesus would say, it's loading over others and imposing it from the top down onto others, right? And so we can think of, in our own context today, right, some want to legislate or have legislated the 10 Commandments to be posted in the public square, right? In some ways, that's the legacy of this mindset of what happened was the church went from not having power to being advantaged by the state. And the church did the state's work and the state did the church's work, both back and forth in such ways that it lost sight of what it meant to actually follow Jesus in the world. And so literally the meaning of discipleship and following Jesus got lost in imperial ideology and logics and imperial demands of what the empire wanted. And so everything that the empire wanted got slapped as Christian as well.
Right. So, I mean, there were a lot of problems with Christendom. Is there like, what's the worst of it in terms of a theological legacy?
Yeah, what's the worst of it?
Top 10, whatever you want to do.
Top 10. Like, I think we only got 1 hour, but I mean, I do think that the worst of it is actually just the vandalizing of Jesus in the public square and the loss of what it means to actually follow Jesus, right? I think that many people today call themselves Christians and they don't actually have any intention of following, immersing, abiding in, and embodying the birth, life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? And so when you call yourself a Christian and it's not a Jesus-shaped way of life that's committed to, speaking truthfully, loving your neighbors, prioritizing the least, last, lost, and little ones in society as Jesus did, then in some ways you've really co-opted and made a puppet of the word Christian in ways that are really horrifying and can actually be used to justify just about anything.
Right. Well, this may be more like a psychological or sociological question, but you're up for it, right?
Okay, let's go for it.
You have a choice because I got the mic here in my hand. So how do you think that many Christians can still live within Christendom's assumptions? Like, I mean, where is the self-critique? Is it just so deeply embedded that we don't notice it? Sort of like white privilege, we don't notice it because we're just so much a part of it. I mean, help us out here.
Yeah, I mean, where's the self-critique?
Like you just want to shake people sometimes.
Yeah.
What are you doing here, right?
I mean, I'm sometimes baffled, but to be fair, there's aspects of things that I took for granted that I no longer do, and now they seem so, obvious, right? But I do think some of that is, I do wonder, how many people actually immerse themselves in the story of Jesus? When I ask folks, some basic things, what things I think are basic about the Jesus story, right? The character of Jesus, the commitments of Jesus, sometimes so many folks are oblivious and it just seems like they have not spent time immersing themselves. So I do think, and I don't obviously... Many folks have read scripture and have used it, weaponized it. I don't think that that is some magic answer. Just read the scriptures, and you know
Right.
of all people, right? How the biblical text gets weaponized.
Yeah.
But I do think, like, if we are Christians and we imagine that there is a God calling us to something more, and we were searching and open and kind of bearing ourselves before God, I imagine that it is hard for me to fathom that people can't see at least gaps and contradictions and hypocrisies that are deeply, profoundly anti-Jesus in everything that he taught and embodied in his life. There's some things that I get why we struggle over some things and disagree on. There's a lot of stuff that's messy. And then there's some things that it seems like Jesus made pretty clear, and I just don't really understand how people get there.
Or, I mean, how they just blatantly reimagine Jesus as, you know, the tough guy with a machine gun, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess that suggests that they're not really driven by the gospel. It becomes more a tool to do something else.
I mean, Cohn talked about people's their values and ideological commitments ahead of time are preceding everything, right? So that it was inevitable. They're looking to justify a particular way of life, to justify the status quo that we already have, to justify the social advantages that exist within society. And so if you're looking for those things, you will find them.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, Christendom has been a force, I think, in global Christianity for a long time, and I think it's hard to disentangle ourselves from that. Do you have any practical thoughts for people who are willing? You know, practical thoughts for how they can disentangle themselves from this disease, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that we have to, one, find ourselves in actual communities at the grassroots level that are committed to actually following Jesus, that we need to have communities that are dialogical, that is, they make space. It's not just a one-way conversation from the experts, but there's space for conversation and believing that the Spirit can speak through everyone and that there's room to disagree and work through and try to move towards consensus. I think that within that community, you have to, I think it's pretty clear. Jesus just takes for granted that the least, last, lost, and little ones are part of the community. So if you are a community that only has socially advantaged people in it, you will not have the voices necessary to offer different perspectives in your life. And so who you read scripture with, who you worship with, who you pray with, who you share food with around the table also matters just as much. And you have to have a faith that actually is going to seek to embody and practice that. And I think those are some of the Anabaptists, I think, distinctives of, like there was this idea of, the idea that if you weren't going to try to obey and practice what you were reading, then you already are not ready to read scripture, right? That was kind of like an Anabaptist hermeneutic, that you had to be willing to put it into practice, to embody. It's not just an intellectual exercise.
Yeah. Well, Drew, I imagine a lot of people don't like you very much.
I get myself in a fair amount of trouble.
Which brings me to my next question, actually. You do ask tough questions of white Anabaptists.
Yeah.
I've read your stuff, right? I know you do that. So that can make people defensive. Not me, by the way, I'm just saying, but other people.
Other
people I've heard of, right? But how do you handle, what's a constructive way of handling that? Because it's not like, oh, I'm sorry to offend you, right? But again, practically speaking, how do you have conversations with people that you've just told are really, they've lost the plot, really, okay?
So one of the things that I've done, and I think actually I've had pretty good experiences overall having these kind of conversations with white Anabaptists, is that I've done my homework. I know their stories. I know their traditions. Right. I can talk about Menno Simons and Pilgrim Marpeck and all these folks and Swiss Anabaptists and German Anabaptists, Russian and all this stuff, like things that most people don't expect a black man from Philly who grew up in the black church to know about, right? So, number one, I've demonstrated that I've took the time to understand their tradition and speak to the particularities of that tradition. Right. And so I'm taking them very seriously. And so a lot of what I do in the book, when I have a whole chapter critiquing white Anabaptists, right, in North America. And when I do so, it's clearly out of personal experience and also deep understanding of the tradition. And so it's out of respect. There's some teasing going on, but it's a playful,
there's a
relational...
exasperation, too. I mean, yeah. I just sense that.
Frustration. And frustration not only from me, but I also carry the stories of generations of other black Anabaptists who have told me their stories and experiences. And I've read about Vincent Harding and his frustrations in the 60s with the Mennonite Church, right? I've heard the stories in Church of the Brethren. I've heard stories in the BIC. I've heard stories among the Neo-Anabaptists. And so I can speak to personal experiences as well as some of the scholarship that I've engaged in and research I've done.
Right. You mentioned before the doctrine of discovery. Could you, again, just define that briefly, and then that history seems to be erased in a lot of people's thinking, right? So,
So if Christendom was, this merging of church and state that took centuries, it wasn't this immediate thing. Sometimes we put everything on Constantine, like he did everything. It was many, many centuries of development, and I talk about that in the book. But when you get to, so after the Crusades, and then in 1441, Portugal begins to enslave African people. And they do it theologically justifying what they're doing, right? And immediately there's anti-blackness already there. There's God's sovereignty and this and all these contradictions that are there already in 1441. And then shortly after that, you have a papal bull, right? A legal church teaching. It's both church doctrine and social law, right? Civic law. It's basically saying, like, you've got permission from the church to go take over other people's lands and to reduce people to perpetual slavery. It literally says that.
Permission from God.
Permission from
really, that's
God.
really what it comes down to, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Right. And then Spain's like, let me get in on the action.
Yeah, why not?
Right?
Yeah.
And so they get in on the action, and then they're like, oh, we need more papal bulls because we got to expand. And so a series of these papal bulls, what's called the doctrine of discovery, basically is the church giving, which both Catholics and Protestants ran with, permission to go engage in conquests, to colonize lands, to steal lands, to steal bodies, to steal labor, to steal resources, right? To engage in all kinds of plunder in the name of Jesus. And so the doctrine of discovery is behind the global Western conquests that we see unfolding, right, from, again, that late 15th century or mid 15th century all the way up for centuries, and justified so much of the policies that we saw in the United States. So when we think about the conquest that took place here, when we talk about manifest destiny and all the slavery and stuff, it's all this outfolding of the church's engineering of both church doctrine and law and policy. There are folks that are writing about this more slowly, but it's not a widespread conversation. And so when we're not aware of it, we can think, oh yeah, the secular society did all this and the church got drug into it. No, the church was at the forefront of constructing these realities.
And today, benefiting from that.
Yes.
If, I don't want to misstate this, but without themselves necessarily looking for other lands to take over for God. Right, we have all the land we need, it's ours, it's a divine right, and that's coming out a lot today, politically too, I think, right, yeah, so. Okay, this is a serious question because I struggle with this myself. How can non-black Christians learn from the black church without falling into appropriation?
One of the ways I invite people into that process is to think about it like this. So often the way in which many people engage, especially when white folk want to engage other people's cultures, it's in some ways perpetuating the legacy of plunder, right? It's just grabbing other people's stuff. And that's what a lot of the multicultural practice of white communities is, just like, we're just going to grab this and grab this and grab this and grab this. And so you appropriate these different aspects, but people are not being transformed by these traditions, right? And so what I want to invite people into is not just extraction of other people's cultures so that you can collect, all the rings, but that you actually become a student and become immersed in. So if I can take the time to learn about Anabaptists and to step into spaces and to be shaped by a tradition, then white people can do the same and reciprocate and learn about other people's traditions and be transformed by them as well. And so it's so striking that most white people are just waiting around for black folk and brown folk to come into their communities and their institutions and to read all their stuff. Why don't you step into black communities, black spaces, black churches, immerse yourself in the literature and the history, right? And so I think it's that more immersive practice that allows you to be transformed and changed as a person and not just collecting things to wear around your necklace.
Right. That you haven't earned the right to use, right? So, but why? But why don't white people do that more often?
They don't have to.
We don't have to. We're in power, right?
They're in power, and they don't have to think about the consequences of those kind of decisions and practices.
That's not a very Jesus-y way to live, if you ask me, right? So anyway, where's Alex? Did he leave? A couple more questions? 5 minutes? Yeah. All right. All right. So. Couple practical questions here. So you close the book with what you call to salvage the way, right? And what does that phrase mean to you? Theologically, because that's important, but also personally. Yeah.
So I got the phrase. It's almost a haunting phrase that at least is partially coming out of J. Cameron Carter's work in a book called Race, A Theological Account. At the very, very end of it, you can almost miss it. In his epilogue, he talks about how I forget how exactly he says, but the darker peoples under modernity salvaged Christianity from being a death-dealing discourse to their death, right? And some of that language, it just stuck with me for a while. I use it even in my dissertation way back when. Just this idea, because I think about both Anabaptism and the Black Church as two Christian traditions on the underside of Western Christianity that experience severe violence, persecution, or oppression, right? At the hands of other Christians. And it's precisely at that moment that I think that they become a gift as they both refuse to either just adopt what was being imposed on them, but instead pushed through and salvaged and found a more faithful way, right? And the language of the way, like early Christians talked about, it wasn't just your beliefs and doctrines and propositions, it's a way of life, right? And so both of those traditions found and salvaged a way of life that actually looked more Jesus-shaped. Right. And so for me, salvaging the way, putting them into conversation together on a practical level, like for me, it's what does it mean to look at the particularity of Jesus? Both traditions are very concerned with the specifics of the character of Jesus, what he does, his life, who he associates with, and different emphases, right? Anabaptism, peacemaking, love, Black church, right? The social condition, who Jesus associated with, right? Those with their died. Those with their backs against the wall, right? Those are the folks that Jesus emphasizing, so that what does it look to have that kind of radical discipleship and prophetic witness that models both of those emphases? And what does it look like to practice peacemaking and liberation as understood by these different traditions in conversation? What does it look like to think about, I talk about even like the fugitivity of the Black church, of living outside the surveillance of those in charge, right? And the martyrdom witness, not as seeking to die, but the truest sense of the word witness, as in living truthfully even to the point of death, right? I think that there's some gifts that I think these two traditions and conversation, I'm just obviously giving little fragments right now because we don't have a lot of time, but I think that they invite us into a different way of life, a different mode, a different disposition, and different practices that I think can only come, we can read about it first, but you also have to come alongside folks and journey with folks and learn these practices. And I think that some of this Anabaptism kind of invitation I'm inviting people into is a way of finding ourselves outside of this white Christian nationalism and all the harm that really Christians are involved in this present moment, towards something that is actually liberating instead of harmful, and healing and loving and justice oriented, and all the kind of things that I think Jesus calls us and invites us into.
Well, just one more question, maybe. I mean, this is a heavy topic. It is a heavy topic. It's burdensome. It's sad. It elicits a lot of emotions, and I imagine for you it does, as many people here. Where do you have hope? Like, are you hopeful?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways I can answer this question. I will say this, and then I'll invite people to look at my chapter called "Is the Black Church Dead?" to go a little deeper. But I'll say this, that we need to look at. I don't have hope in America. I don't have hope in society that it's going to be on some natural progress towards, enlightenment or anything like that. But I do think that as a follower of Jesus, I confess that God has broken into this world, and has, I'll use my colleague Richard Crane's language, has begun an insurrection. And that is meaningful and can only be hopeful in the ways that it is actually embodied in the world by a people and a community. So that is to say that my hope is and exists where Jesus exists as the body of Christ in the world that actually is liberating in the world. If there is no actual community, people that are embodying good news in the world, then there is no hope. But God existing in Jesus, in the world, concretely embodied, that is where hope is. It's existing, embodied, and real, and tangible, and people can feel that.
Thank you. Hi, Alex. So now what? We're going to let people talk, right? Okay.
Yeah, so if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. If you want to try that,
It might, there we go. There we go, we're back.
So if you want to raise your hand, I'll come around the mic. We'll start in this general area.
That's true, Dr. Hart. Thank you for sharing with us. The Anabaptist story, after all the persecution, they became known as the silent ones. And they became insular and withdrawn into their own community. And I'm not sure if that has also happened in the Black church too. I don't know if you address that. You beat so much to the pulp that you just become insular. And what you do with that in we see a name, confirmation of God, other than the righteousness of the Pharisee.
Yeah. So for the first question, yeah, I talk about all of that in the book. I am not, the gloves are off with the Anabaptists on how Anabaptism shows up in North America. In fact, I'll put it out there now. I revoke North American Anabaptists' Peace Church card in North America, right? That is to say, in North America, when they come here, they are quiet. It's one thing to say slavery's wrong, but they're quietist in the midst of what's going on. They're, as indigenous people are being dispossessed from lands, white Anabaptists are getting lands on cents on the dollar before the blood has dried. They're benefiting from slave economies, even if they're not the ones enslaving people, right? So if Anabaptist theologians themselves say peace is not just the absence of violence, but the positive presence of justice and righteousness and all that stuff, right? Well, if that's the case, then they did not practice peace in North America. So I revoke that card, but I invite them to become a shalom church, right? To actually be a church. And here's the thing, when Anabaptists, because some will say, well, we were huddling down and stuff. But when Anabaptists, when they were going to be, enrolled for war, they became lobbyists to the government. So they did lobby to the government and believed in it for themselves. They just didn't do it for their black brothers and sisters. So we have to name those contradictions, right? I do think there's a lot they can learn from the black church, precisely as it relates to the prophetic witness in the public square and how to engage society and the broader government and social order and all of that. And I think the black church tradition as a whole, not just in the present, but as a whole, even during slavery, I push on the black church, because sometimes we're so reliant on the government, we gotta vote, I'm like, don't forget, we won the vote when we didn't even have the vote. We weren't just twiddling our thumbs, we were organizing, we were building institutions, we were networking, there were abolitionists and this and that. There's all these grassroots things that were happening. That's also political activity, right? And maybe I'll, just for other folks' sake, I'll give time, in the book I do talk about Anabaptist influences beyond just two kingdom separation that you get from the Schleitheim articles, that there are Pilgrim Marpeck and Balthasar Hubmaier and others provide, I think, more nuanced ways for Anabaptists to think about social engagement while still taking seriously what it means to be the church.
How does the stake in
I'm just curious if you have thoughts either from yourself or from the perspective of the Black Church and the Anabaptist Church about kind of how the echoes of Christendom and the presence of Christian activism and the Christians that are finding themselves in power right now seem so eager to have that power, but also existing alongside a narrative of persecution that, it can't listen to news or anything without hearing every 5 minutes that the church is under attack and we're being persecuted and all of these things. When you have two groups that have a history of true generational persecution, and here we have this powerful church that is so eager to claim persecution as a narrative, and I'm just curious kind of how you would address that from the context of the persecuted church.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's not a surprise given how we've come along. There's no question in the Bible that followers of Jesus are expected to experience suffering, right? And we're told to take up our cross. And so you can have socially advantaged Christians, they're reading their Bibles and they're seeing these words. They're seeing suffering, they're seeing persecution, And so what they've done is they've redefined it all to fit their first world's problems, right? And I think in general, it's a very common strategy for those in power when there's critiques to engage in reversal, right? To reverse positions, to claim that the opposite is the one that's actually doing the harm. And so that's also a strategy, like I think they talk about like perpetrator-victim kind of abuse. Like those are cycles that are also prevalent. So you add those two things together, this inclination for perpetrators to reverse and claim opposite roles, and this framework in the Bible where it's clear that followers of Jesus are supposed to be suffering and be faithfully living out. And so they want to claim it. I think that's the urge, right? That they've got to claim it for themselves, and then they've got to somehow make it seem that the people who are most suffering are actually the ones that are actually the bullies in the world. And so I think that's deeply, profoundly operative in a lot of the Christian nationalist dialogue and rhetoric that I think you're certainly describing. Yeah.
There's that question in the back there.
Say it again.
Is God a racist? Okay. Another thing I thought about a black person in jail, and I see this the bar, and a white person or policeman on the other side. You know what I'm saying? Is that bar, is that God, or is that the spirit? And I thought about Moses and the children of the Israelite children when they were in the desert for 40 years. What was the purpose of them being in there? Was that to teach them something? Or what?
So I love the first question because I literally, so in the chapter that I write kind of challenging the black church, that chapter, I have a portion where I actually mention William R. Jones, who wrote a piece. This is from decades ago. He's a black philosopher, humanist, who actually asked the question, is God a white racist, right? He asked that question. Now, he doesn't actually think God is a white racist, but he actually wants to problematize black faith. The reason why he asks that question, so he wants to think about it from a philosophical standpoint, right? His question is, all right, so black Christians, you say God is good and liberating. You say God is all controlling. So if that's true, then there must be historical evidence for where we can see that play out. And all evidence right now looks more like God is a white racist than God is a liberator. That was his philosophical argument, right? There's been black theologians, and I think James Cone certainly has responded to him really well. But I do think to ask that question is an important one for us to reckon with the fact that what we see, God is not self-evident. And I say that, I don't say that in a negative way. I actually say that in the sense that as Christendom crumbles, like it's going to, we're in some ways, early Christians, they believed and confessed God when God was not self-evident. And I think for many centuries in the West, God became self-evident. He actually didn't need faith. It was just God, because we believed and claimed God's in control of the structures, right? And we're winning, right? And that's not the case anymore. And so I do think that we are in a place where we have to do some scary soul searching. Where are you, God? Why is it that the wicked prosper, right? That's the refrain from the Old Testament, right? Why is it that whose side are you actually on when we actually look at the evidence of what's happening all around us? And can we see the evidence of God at work in the world despite the way that the wicked do often prosper, right? So I think those are good questions that I think we've got to reckon with. I think the Exodus story is really meaningful more as I think it becomes meaningful for the Israelites, and I've got the real scholar beside me here, but it's during Babylonian exile, that story takes on life for them as they're trying to figure out who they are and what kind of stories about God's deliverance are going to help them make it through on the other side, right? So I do think that kind of story becomes really meaningful that's why I think African Americans, despite how white slave masters taught the scriptures, Black folk, they clung to the Exodus motif because it resonated with their lived experience, right? And it offered them an insight that despite what's going on in the midst of empire and our enslavement and the humiliation, degradation we're experiencing, we confess and believe and are seeking to participate in a delivering God, right? And they sought after that, and that motivated them and gave them a vision, an intergenerational vision that sustained them for the fight, for the struggle.
So as you reconsider the future of the church landscape, if the church were to take up the call, the things you challenge in your book, what would you say would be the difference? What would it look like? How would we know that we're following in a way, we're not just creating a new version of something we're doing now?
I guess the places that you would know would be in the communities that you're a part of, right? In the same way that I answered that hope question, like are there actual communities that are embodying a different way? So it would look like a community that actually formed and discipled people into these kinds of practices, that not just studied, not all the scriptures, but I do think especially the life and teachings of Jesus, and did that in community with voices that are different from them, not just racial differences, but socioeconomic differences and class and all sexuality, gender, everyone's voices being heard in ways that actually allow us to hear the Spirit speak through the community, discerning, and then actually embodying what it means to participate in God's inbreaking kingdom in the world, right? There is no one cookie cutter way that's going to look. So I don't know exactly how to answer that other than I could talk about communities I've seen, right? I joke sometimes, I'm like, in terms of Anabaptism, I would say the best place to be an Anabaptist is Philadelphia, right? Because I just saw amazing. I realized there that Anabaptism is so much broader than anything I had realized. Third generation Black Anabaptist congregations, right? I think about my friend Juan. He was a pastor in North Philly, and I think almost 2/3 of his congregation in North Philly were returning citizens from prison, right? I think about in Northeast Philly and the kind of CCDA-ish kind of community development work that they were doing there in their community and the impact that it was having. I think about West Philly Mennonites and the community organizing work that they were doing in their neighborhood with Power Interfaith around funding for public education, right? I think about Germantown Mennonites and the inclusive space that they had created for those that had been stigmatized and not welcomed in other churches, right? I think that, so I can only point to actual communities, this diversity of ways of manifesting, actual expression, the manifold witness of the church on the ground, because there is no one way, and none of us will have it all. I think that's part of it too, and maybe some of the idea of Anabaptism, these two traditions together, isn't that, once you get these two together, then we've got it all, right? I think there's still other gifts and other traditions and learnings that need to happen, but I do think that these two, as it relates to some of these problems that we're dealing with, are really, really fundamental and essential. But I do think it's always concrete in actual community, embodied and lived out in terms of the actual significance of it.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Well, I don't know if I could phrase this, but when it comes to, I guess, the Black church and just churches that are more,
Absolutely. So I do talk about that directly, and I do it in the chapter as well, in Conversation with the Black Church. I talk about the patriarchy and sexism and homophobia that is in many. So I differentiate. So I think it's very important that, it's even in the Black church, like, we all want to take credit for the civil rights movement, and we all want to take credit for the struggle, right? But let's be honest, like, a lot of Black churches were not, even then, were not willing to get involved, right? Not everyone was willing to risk themselves at that moment. The church that I grew up in was not a civil rights legacy church, right? Let's be honest, it just wasn't. And so I do think it's helpful to differentiate between the broad Black church, which I think as a whole still has played an enormous role in the life of the Black community. So I don't want to take that away, and I celebrate that in the book as well. But then I talk about the prophetic stream of the Black church, which I think is really the heart and soul of the legacy of the Black church's abolitionism and freedom struggle and civil rights, all the way up to today when we're thinking about, Otis Moss III in Chicago and Reverend Barber, right, and all that kind of. So I think that that community actually models really well, I think, holding a lot of the intersectional injustices and intersectional oppressions really well. I think actually there's a lot that I think a lot of progressive white communities could learn from how they hold all of that together, while usually, like in many other churches, it's either like you either do racial justice or you handle gender, or it's inclusive for sexual minorities. It's like one group, right? But I think what's beautiful about a lot of the prophetic tradition churches that I know, not all of them, but a lot of them, there is this healthy intersectional awareness that actually seeking liberation for all oppressed people. And I think that's the kind of conversation that we need to kind of all be moving towards. Yeah.
Sure, we made it up to the mezzanine, so we're right up here, and this will be our last question.
Thank you. I'd really like the title. Would you be willing to share how that came about?
I mean, the title was just in conversation with my publishers back and forth. But the idea, I mean, it's not as hard. It's always the way it goes, right? We did have conversation back and forth, and we kind of worked towards and then landed on making it plain. But the idea, I mean, you can hear in it, it was trying to do a little play on words that represented both traditions, right? And so in the Black church, in the preaching moments, right, the oral, right, you got to tell the preacher, what do you say, Brother Joe? Make it plain, right? So you got to let the preacher know, bring it down, make it accessible, right, for the folks. And so so there's that tradition of making it plain. But then there's also in Anabaptism, the plain tradition, right? And thinking about the simplicity that Anabaptism often offers and invites people into as we follow the way of Jesus. There's that emphasis as well. And so that was just a creative way to kind of play on both traditions and kind of show a little love, a little wink, both directions a little bit in honor of their legacies.
We get one more round of applause for Drew Hart. Congrats on the book. Thanks to Pete for coming out and moderating the conversation. We're now going to transition to the book signing. So that's going to be outside these doors to the left in the Rare Books building. Drew's going to be over there. He'll sign copies of his book. We have all three of Drew's books available for purchase, and also we have all of Pete's books